Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich darf Sie im Namen der Humboldt-Universität und des Instituts für deutsche Literatur sehr herzlich zur heutigen Mosse-Lecture begrüßen, von ungewohntem Ort aus und auch, wie Sie sehen, in ungewohnter Beleuchtung, denn wie es der Zufall will, ist das der Moment, wo die Sonne direkt in mein Gesicht strahlt. Wir haben aber vorhin schon darüber gesprochen, dass wir das aus Gründen auch des Themas so lassen und diese Film-Noir-Anmutung, die ich dadurch habe, hier durch den Abend tragen. Es geht in diesem Sommersemester, wie Sie wissen, um Verschwörungstheorien, um ihre Virulenz in der schlechten Unendlichkeit der Pandemie, um die Informationstechnologien und sozialen Echokammern, die die Verbreitung solcher Theorien begünstigen, um die Attraktivität, die ihre Erklärungsangebote entwickeln, und es geht um die Schwierigkeiten dieser Fabulationslust mit kleinteiligen Widerlegungen und nachgereichten Faktenchecks beizukommen. Denn wie Stefan Willer zum Auftakt unserer Vortragsreihe zu Recht hervorgehoben hat, beginnt der Streit bereits beim Etikett. Aluhutträger sind immer die anderen. Kein Verschwörungstheoretiker würde sich selbst so nennen, sondern vielmehr darauf beharren, dass die Mehrheitsgesellschaft sich leichtgläubig beschwatzen lässt und falschen Mainstream-Medien traut, während er selbst in den Worten Eva Horns ein Besserwisser ist. Ein skeptisches Subjekt, das sein Recht auf Selbstbestimmung im dissidenten Vernunftgebrauch ausübt und das im Querdenken den Königsweg zu Wahrheiten entdeckt, die doch offenbar sind, wenn man sie nur sehen will. Muss man solche Regungen des kritischen Geistes also nicht erst einmal als Formen eines Willens zum Wissen begrüßen, der sich als Eigenwille manifestiert und heterodoxe Positionen nicht per se verteufelt? Und beruht nicht unser Wissen über Verschwörungstheorien und ihre Anhänger auf Vorurteilen, die selbst fragwürdig sind? Nichts ist, wie es scheint, so hat der Kulturwissenschaftler Michael Butter sein einführendes Buch über Verschwörungstheorien betitelt, das vor 3 Jahren im Surkamp Verlag erschienen ist. Und der Titel hat dort einen doppelten Sinn. Er will einerseits Zitat sein, Echo jenes Refrains, den diejenigen anstimmen, die durchschauen, was die breite Masse von Schiepel, also Schlafschafen, entweder nicht sehen kann oder nicht sehen will. Andererseits soll der Titel aber auch ohne Anführungszeichen gelesen werden. Denn korrekturbedürftig sind, wie Michael Butter schreibt, nicht nur die Verschwörungstheorien selbst, sondern auch viele Theorien, die über sie zirkulieren. Vor Augen hat er dabei insbesondere den Essay eines Historikers, der vor fast 50 Jahren publiziert wurde, aber bis heute gerne zitiert wird. Sein Verfasser ist Richard Hofstadter. Sein Essay kam im November 1964 in Harper's Magazine heraus. Hofstadter verglich die Verschwörungstheorien, die damals in den USA kursierten, sehr plakativ mit Vorstellungen von Verfolgungswahn. Indem er auf die Nähe der Wahlkampfrhetorik zum paranoiden Denkstil abhob, wollte er den Blick auf pathologische Entwicklungen in der US-Politik lenken und erklären, wie es kommen konnte, dass anstelle eines gemäßigten Kandidaten der rechtsextreme Barry Goldwater als Präsidentschaftskandidat der Republikaner nominiert wurde. Für Hofstadter war das 1964 ein ähnlicher Dammbruch wie 2016 für die Demokraten die Wahl Donald Trumps. Dass man Politik mit Schauermähren von mächtigen Feinden machte, die sich gegen das wahre Amerika zu einer Achse des Bösen verbündet hatten, war in der US-Politik, wie Hofstadter zugab, zwar nicht neu, aber es war bislang keine Position gewesen, die es zur Mehrheitsfähigkeit gebracht hätte. Allerdings gab es in den 60er Jahren Vorboten, denn erst im Jahrzehnt zuvor hatte Goldwaters Freund Joseph McCarthy eine Kampagne losgetreten, mit der kommunistische Umtriebe in den USA rigoros bekämpft werden sollten. Eliot Borenstein, den wir heute als Gast in New York begrüßen, ist US-amerikanischer Slawist und er hat in seinem Buch Plots Against Russia daran erinnert, dass auch sein eigenes Fach von diesem antikommunistischen Furor nicht unberührt blieb, ja während des Kalten Kriegs gewissermaßen Kriegsgewinnler war. Schließlich warf das Studium der russischen Literatur und Kultur ein nützliches Wissen über die Mentalität des ideologischen Gegners ab. Und es trug auf diese Weise, wie mittelbar auch immer, zur unablässigen Feindbeobachtung bei und war Teil einer Kremlinologie, die im Stil geheimdienstlicher Kriminologie betrieben wurde. Vor 1989, schreibt Borenstein, wäre es ihm deswegen unmöglich gewesen, ein Buch über russische Verschwörungstheorien zu schreiben, ohne unweigerlich den Vorwurf auf sich zu ziehen, selbst als paranoider Amerikaner zu agieren, der unter dem Deckmantel der Wissenschaft dieselbe Dämonisierung der Sowjetunion betreibt wie die eigene Regierung. Wenn die Zeit für Bücher dieser Art inzwischen günstiger ist, so hat das jedoch nicht nur mit dem Fall des Eisernen Vorhangs zu tun, sondern auch mit grundlegenderen Umwälzungen in Russland selbst. Vor allem dank des Internets hat sich doch die repressive Medienlandschaft, in der ein Zugang zu Informationen für die Bevölkerung lange Zeit sehr eingeschränkt war, völlig verändert. Mittlerweile ist das Gegenteil der Fall. Informationen werden unablässig produziert, über Messenger-Apps versandt und auf Plattformen geteilt. So ist, wie Eliot Borenstein in seinem Vortrag ausführen wird, ein neuartiger Quellgrund für Verschwörungstheorien entstanden, die sowohl von Putin-treuen Staatsmedien als auch von der Opposition produziert werden. Auf den Begriff der Paranoia möchte er in seinen Analysen nicht verzichten, damit aber weniger die betreffenden Leute stigmatisieren, als im Sinne Hofstetters den Stil kennzeichnen, in dem die politische Phantasmenbildung betrieben wird. Eliot Borenstein ist seit 1995, wenn ich das richtig verfolgt habe, Professor für Slawistik an der New York University und seine wissenschaftlichen Arbeiten sind schwerpunktmäßig mit der russischen Gegenwartsliteratur und Populärkultur befasst. Sein eben erwähntes Buch mit dem Titel Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism ist 2019 erschienen und im Folgejahr gleich mit 2 Preisen ausgezeichnet worden. Im letzten Jahr, 2020, kam seine Studie zu den Punk-Ikonen des russischen Feminismus heraus. Ihr Titel lautet Pussy Riot, Speaking Punk to Power. Dann sind 2 weitere Studien derzeit im Druck, die im nächsten Jahr vorliegen sollen, darunter eines über das russische Internet, seine Memes und Videos. Michael Butter, den ich ebenfalls sehr herzlich willkommen heiße, wird den weiteren Verlauf des Abends als Respondent und Gesprächspartner mit bestreiten und darüber freuen wir uns sehr. Sein weithin wahrgenommenes, bei Polity Press inzwischen auch auf Englisch erschienenes Buch über Verschwörungstheorien von 2018 habe ich bereits genannt und möchte ergänzen, dass Michael Butter in Tübingen lehrt, wo er seit 2014 eine Professur für Amerikanistik innehat. Als Kenner von Verschwörungsmythen und Feindimaginationen ist er bereits zuvor durch mehrere Studien hervorgetreten, so zum Beispiel 2009 als Autor von The Epitome of Evil, Hitler in American Fiction 1939 to 2002 oder 2014 mit dem Buch Plots, Designs and Schemes, American Conspiracy Theories from the Puritans to the Present. Derzeit verfolgt er sein Interesse an Verschwörungstheorien in einem internationalen Forschungsprojekt zum Populismus in Europa sowie in Nord- und Südamerika weiter. Der European Research Council fördert dieses Unternehmen seit dem vergangenen Jahr. Wir werden unser transatlantisches Gespräch über Eliot Borensteins Vortrag und Michael Butters Respondenz zunächst zu dritt beginnen, möchten Sie aber jetzt schon ganz herzlich einladen, sich mit Ihren Fragen in das Gespräch einzubringen. Das können Sie diesmal auf 2 Wegen tun, nämlich einmal über den Live-Chat von YouTube und dann über die E-Mail-Adresse Mosse-Lectures in einem Wort @hu-berlin.de. Die Adresse wird auch noch einmal eingeblendet. Nun soll aber endlich Eliot Borenstein das Wort haben. Der Titel seines Vortrags lautet Informing Ourselves to Death, Conspiracy and Fantasy in Postmodern Russia, Mr. Borenstein, thank you very much for being here with us tonight and taking us both to New York and to Postmodern Russian at the very same time. We are very excited and happy to have you as our guest and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Ethel, for what I'm going to assume was a very nice introduction. And also thank you, Denise, for all your organization of this. And thank you, Michael, for agreeing to talk with me to continue our conversations. Michael's work has always been required reading. I have it on my phone right now, but I'm not going to read it at the moment because I'm afraid I'm going to be a bit busy. It's also just such an honor for me to have the chance to deliver a George Mosse lecture, because when I was working on my dissertation at the University of Wisconsin, and I was writing about masculinity in the Soviet period, George Mosse's book, Nationalism and Sexuality, was one of the few works I could find that really spoke to what I was trying to do. And I just have valued him. I should have known his work before that, but I just found it so valuable ever since. So I really appreciate the chance to be here. Also, your patience with me for speaking in English. I did pass a reading knowledge exam of German when I was in graduate school, but only because the person administering the exam was not very strict about the clock. And so I never should have passed that exam, and I'm not going to pretend that I could pass it now. Anyway, so this talk comes from my book, Plots Against Russia, which came out in 2019. And this was a topic I was working on for many years. It was going to be part of a previous book. And it was a funny thing because I was always concerned that I was maybe paying attention to something that was too much of a fringe phenomenon and giving too much emphasis to something that's going to distort the picture of Russia. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be true. By the time I actually was working on the book, a lot of the stuff I was talking about had gone from the margins to the center. And then even further, by the time I was done with the book, my own country had gone down a terrible conspiratorial rabbit hole from which we have yet to emerge. So I would much rather that what I was working on were irrelevant, because I'm used to being irrelevant. That's the space we Russian experts have been very comfortable in for the past 30 years. But this all took me by surprise. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, here we go. All right, play. So this is obviously the title of the talk. It's not letting, come on, play. I have, right, there we go. I can move, there we go. Now I can find play. Good, okay. So yes, this is from my book. These are the chapters for what it's worth. Anyway, I will begin. So after spending enough time on the Russian internet, flipping channels on state television, leafing through extremist newspapers, or simply reading the latest action-packed thrillers, it's easy to come to the conclusion that Russia is under siege, from within as well as from without. The country's apparent enemies include Muslims, communists, oligarchs, the CIA, the FSB, Georgians, Ukrainians, a rainbow coalition of color revolutionaries, homosexuals, Harvard University, and let's not forget the Jews, because trust me, no one else has. The building blocks of conspiracy may change, or more likely simply increase in number, but their possible combinations and permutations are limitless only on the level of small details. Now, if it seems like I'm picking on Russia, I want to quickly point out that anyone with a Facebook friend who watches Fox News can testify that America is hardly immune to syncretic conspiratorial thinking. After all, my country has on 2 separate occasions elected a gay Kenyan Muslim Black separatist socialist secular antichrist, proving yet again that for a Black man to succeed in America, he has to overachieve. The fact that he was succeeded in office by a man who praises Alex Jones's InfoWars and the National Enquirer, while hyping non-existent voter fraud threats that should speak for itself. But the failed insurrection of January 6th does, however, suggest that it did not speak for itself. Indeed, we could see the growth of conspiracy theory in both Russia and the United States as yet another manifestation of a nearly century-long rivalry. Which country can outperform the other in the production of conspiracy theory? The rise of conspiratorial thought in the United States is a well-studied and sadly relevant phenomenon. Russia's multiple brands of conspiracy are far less familiar to a global audience, but the country has not been idle. For at least 50 years, Russia, along with the Russophone diaspora, has been a reliable provider of conspiratorial narratives, overfulfilling virtually any conceivable plan with the zeal of a Stakhanovite shock worker under Stalin. Now, I use the hackneyed metaphor of the Soviet shock worker advisedly. since it has been decades since Russia could be accused of the hyperproduction of anything, or at least of anything tangible. Here I recall Mikhail Epstein's marvelous essay, Labor of Lust, from his book After the Future, where he demonstrates that any failure to produce factories, heavy machinery, and weapons on the scale demanded by the various Soviet five-year plans was easily remedied by a proliferation of images and texts, that is, discourse about factories, heavy machinery, and weapons. In the symbolic realm, Russia and the Soviet Union was a powerhouse of productivity, a tireless manufacturer of simulacra and simulation. Conspiracy, however, is more than mere simulation. It takes all the various mythemes available to it and turns them into a persuasive narrative. That is, conspiracy is a kind of discursive bricolage, but even this formulation is not entirely satisfactory, since it looks at conspiracy on too large a scale. The basis of all the mythemes and tropes that form a conspiracy theory is a much more fundamental substance: information. Conspiracy is a disease of information, and a communicable disease at that. A better word, though, would be disorder, if it weren't for the fact that conspiracy's relation to information is to take what is disordered and express it as an excess of order. It is a disorder of signal to noise, in which all noise is construed as signal. It's helpful to recall that quantum physics teaches us to think of the entire universe in terms of information. Conspiracy does for information-based models of quantum physics what centuries of mad scientists, failed attempts at perpetual motion machines could not do for Newtonian physics. Conspiracy fights entropy without increasing entropy. Operating according to an inversion of the third law of thermodynamics, conspiracy concentrates all information into an increasingly orderly system. Conspiracy takes on its form and character in direct relation to a given society's information ecosystem, that is, to the media cultural habitat that can facilitate and or restrict the circulation of information. In Russia, over the last 50 years or so, we find three particular information ecosystems that give rise to three distinct phases of conspiracy theory. The first is late socialism. The second is roughly coextensive with perestroika and the Yeltsin years. I should have had the 80s. Yeah, perestroika and the Yeltsin years. I got the dates here wrong. And the third is the last part of the Putin era, which is coextensive with the rise of social media. Unlike so many patterns that experts are used to seeking and finding in modern Russia, these phases are not characterized by rupture. Indeed, the very syncretism that is so fundamental to conspiratorial thought admits no rupture, to the extent that it admits no contradictions. Though conspiracy's approach to information is anti-entropic, its development is always expansionist and hegemonic. Everything fits, and every seeming contradiction can be turned into another confirmation. In the American context, Michael Barkun shows us the confluence of initially separate conspiracy theories into one master conspiratorial narrative whose complexity would put Foucault's pendulum to shame. Any good conspirologist knows that the Elders of Zion and the Masons are actually working with both the lizard people, who dwell within our hollow earth, and the gray-skinned aliens, who are somehow never satisfied, no matter how many anal probes they perform on unwilling abductees. Apparently, anal probes are like potato chips. You can't stop at just one. Late socialism functioned as a petri dish for conspiracy theories, providing the ideal conditions for their development. First, we must acknowledge that there was no need to invent conspiracy whole cloth. It is Tsarist Russia that gave us the protocols of the Elders of Zion, though in one of Russian culture's perpetual ironies, even this native product turned out to have been initially taken from France, like neoclassicism or the horrific supposedly French dish known in Russian as salade olivier, which is just as bad as this looks, before being Russified to the point of becoming unrecognizable. Added to the semi-native heritage is the lesson that the protocol's pedigree teaches us. Conspiracy theories cross national boundaries with the greatest of ease, which means that the entire European heritage of conspiracy theory was at late socialist USSR's disposal. Yet it was more than just this heritage that made late socialism such an amenable home for conspiracy theory. The Brezhnev era was marked by any number of shortages of this or that consumer good, but what was in truly short supply was information. The state media and government famously restricted access to news and cultural production. Though the USSR's official ideology was, of course, communist, its approach to information was decidedly mercantilist. Information was a scarce resource to be conserved, if not hoarded, and the state jealously guarded its stash of information like a dragon sitting on its treasure trove of gold. But the absence of gold encourages the development of alternative currencies. Indeed, one could say that Bitcoin is conspiracy as payment system. The lack of reliable information and the nakedly partisan information in which information was presented not only facilitated skepticism about official pronouncements, but also left a knowledge vacuum easily filled by speculation and rumor. Far from hard currency, it was all that people had. Again, the effects of information deprivation went far beyond the national boundaries. In the West, Kremlinology thrived on a paranoid conspiratorial epistemology that combed over every word in Pravda and every movement in a state funeral for something on which to construct an often shaky hypothesis. It is this skepticism that shows the weakness of the old propaganda model of mass culture. In response to the clear limits of official information, Soviet subjects of late socialism did not simply accept everything they heard uncritically, just as most of them did not become anti-Soviet dissidents. Rather, the assumption that people are being lied to produced an entire genre of what might be considered urban folklore, or at least urban folk knowledge, alternative theories about what's really going on and who is really in charge. Engaging in this sort of speculation did not necessarily entail adopting an anti-Soviet subject position. Quite to the contrary, casual everyday conspiracism could even be viewed as defining the late Soviet subject position. The assumption that all leaders and bureaucrats are self-interested liars is certainly cynical, but by no means revolutionary, in that its challenge is not to the utopian ideology of the regime, but to the utopian anthropology that justifies it. Late socialist casual conspiracy turns its skeptical eye on human nature far more than it does on this or that political system. More committed conspiracism, on the other hand, directly challenged the regime of power knowledge that constituted late Soviet ideology. Here we have right-wing dissident counter-narratives complete with their own myths of origin. For the sake of brevity, which is a virtue that I'm not really known for, let me simply mention just a couple of the more important conspiratorial narratives floating around at the time. So first, there are the various versions of the theory that the United States is conducting covert operations to destroy the Soviet Union or Russia by subverting public morals and destroying Russian culture. As so often happens with conspiracy theory, there's an undeniable grain of truth here. After all, was not the very existence of Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe an open attack on official discourse? We are used to the metaphor of information warfare, which I'm going to return to, but we're used to thinking of it primarily in terms of content. Radio Liberty broadcast the truth, or if you prefer, counter-propaganda, as a direct antidote to the regime's alleged lies. But we can look at the sheer fact of information bombardment as attack. Indeed, this is a not uncommon twist in first contact narratives by North American science fiction writers who posit aliens who are the unwilling recipients of our world's constant broadcasting might see the sheer volume of useless crap coming their way as an attack on their brain's ability to process. The idea of information as weapon makes this narrative almost infinitely flexible, since the United States can be assumed to be facilitating whatever vices are seen by the conspiracy theorist as particularly pernicious. Lately, it's LGBT stuff, as we're going to get to. The most elaborate version of this narrative was developed in emigration, but made its way back to Russia in samizdat, in the unofficial self-publishing. The writings of Grigory Klimov. In both his nonfiction and his novels, which were intended to be read as fictional glosses on hidden truth, Klimov warned his readers about the sinister Garvardsky Project, Harvard Project. The Harvard Project gives the anti-Semitism of the Protocols of Zion a pseudoscientific veneer, updating them with the preoccupations of the Cold War, that is, mind control, the American threat, and with contemporary sexual panic, predatory homosexuals and militant lesbians. Also reinforcing the religious dimension by approaching biblical texts and confessional differences in terms of genetics and evolution. The beauty of Klimov's formulation is that it is both Soviet and anti-Soviet at the same time. The Cold War enemy is truly a threat, but both America and the Soviet Union have been controlled by Jews from the very beginning, which is coded in some of the cover here of his first novel, My Name is Legion, in which all of this is explained in really dismal fictional form. Klimov developed an all-purpose demonology that gives the appearance of rigor while actually being extremely flexible. The result has all the hallmarks of the most Baroque conspiracy theories to attract attention in the West, such as Lyndon LaRouche's assertion that the Queen of England is an international drug kingpin working with the Rothschilds. Klimov finds his enemies slightly closer to home. For decades, Russia has been under siege by a cabal of genetically defective Jews and homosexuals, virtually synonymous in Klimov's lexicon, plotting the country's downfall from behind the ivy-covered walls of course, Harvard University. Somewhat surprisingly, a close cousin of Klimov's theory actually found its way into an official published work of Soviet fiction, the anti-Soviet brainwashing campaign that would eventually take the name the Dulles Plan after Allen Dulles, a very important figure in the US intelligence world. Reminiscent of both Klimov's novel My Name is Legion and Verkhovensky's speech in Dostoevsky's The Devils, or the Possessed, or the Demons, depending on what English translation you're using, the broad contours of the plan first appear in Yuri Dold-Mikhailov's 1965 novel One Man is Still an Army, but reach a much broader audience when attributed to an SS officer in Anatoly Ivanov's film The Eternal Call. And I just want to read what this SS officer says in The Eternal Call, because this ends up being attributed to Americans and to Allen Dulles pretty soon after. When the war ends, everything will work itself out, and we will throw everything we've got, everything we own, all the gold, all the material strength, on turning people into idiots. The human brain, people's consciousness are all capable of change. After we see chaos in them, we will imperceptibly switch out their values for false ones and make them believe in these false values. How, you ask? How? We'll find like-minded people, our allies and our helpers in Russia itself, which often, of course, becomes codes for Jews. Though this particular line of thought would only be christened the Dulles Plan in 1993, it already provided a broad framework for understanding the Cold War in terms of conspiratorial melodrama, while still casting the relations between opposing sides in terms of symbolic exchange. The Dulles Plan's formalization in 1993 points to the second phase of the information ecosystem I mentioned, perestroika in the 1990s. This ecosystem gives us the opposite extreme from that of late socialism. We move from information deprivation to information overload. Here we're dealing with a more recognizably postmodern condition, recognizable because it is the version of the condition that has long obtained in the West. This new embarrassment of informational riches could have served to debunk conspiratorial thinking entirely, but in fact the opposite occurred. Revelation after revelation about the hidden crimes and corruption of the Soviet Union served as confirmation of a paranoid mindset. Thus, previously obscure conspiracies and forgeries start to get a great deal more play. The fake Proto-Slavic Book of Veles, for example, a proto-fascist neo-pagan forgery that purports to lay out the destiny of the Russian nation, or that old favorite, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Moreover, the information ecosystem of perestroika, like so many other aspects of Gorbachev's program, operated counter to its designer's presumed intent. Opening up the archives and admitting the regime's crimes and mistakes only added fuel to the conspiratorial fire. Before Glasnost, the facts had been known or suspected, or speculation had filled in the gaps. Glasnost functioned on the boundaries of revelation and confirmation, since what was brought to light was never entirely unknown. Rather, it is the fundamentally melodramatic ritual of exposure that gave the disclosure meaning and power. It is not that the truth could set you free. The truth itself was set free, released from the confines of conspiratorial epistemology. Yet Glasnost, rather than sounding conspiracy's death knell, gave conspiracy a new lease on life. The exposure of the hidden truth may have meant the end of secrets, but it ultimately confirmed the prevalence of secrecy and the validity of conspiratorial epistemology. Who knows what else they're keeping from us? This is particularly understandable given the pendulum swings of Soviet-era reforms dating back to Khrushchev. Partial truths were doled out during the thaw, only to be elaborated under Gorbachev, but the slow, multi-step striptease process of revelation was not conducive to the belief that the whole truth had been disclosed. By the end of perestroika, everyone had internalized the language of conspiracy, a phenomenon reinforced by popular entertainment. As in the West, conspiracy provides the basic framework for thrillers and action stories. The heroes are inevitably fighting those who plot against Russia, often using a framework that seems to be stripped of its conventional ideological content. The heroes fight organizations that look like right-wing visions of Jews and Masons, but are not called Jews or Masons. In the 1990s, as conspiratorial narratives were now free to combine and recombine like viruses swapping genes, they tended to revolve around one of the dominant paradigms of the post-Soviet era, catastrophe. With catastrophe, conspiracy manages to be both a myth of origin and a prophecy of the future. Here is how our secret enemies brought us to our knees by destroying the USSR, and here is how they're planning to utterly destroy us in the coming days. Just as Engels brackets all of human history between a primitive communitarian lost Eden and an eventual communist golden age, so too does a conspiracy enclose modern Russian history with identically catastrophic origins and endings. The myth is explicitly conspiratorial in that it posits the story of Russia as alternations between greatness and betrayal. These two concepts simultaneously appeal to national pride while explaining away national failure. Conspiracy, after all, is a ready answer to an eternal question. Why are things so bad? In this case, the answer is that we, our land, our resources, our people, are so valuable that evil enemies are plotting against us. And as is so often the case with the conspiracy, there is valid historical evidence that can be made to fit with this assertion, not least among them the Mongol invasion of Tartar yoke, Napoleon's invasion, and World War II. Conspiracy weaves these discrete historical events into a long-term pattern. For its adherents, conspiracy explains everything about Russia. The Soviet Union was founded and or betrayed by Jews, for instance, or it was Jews who got Russians drinking vodka and got them hooked on it. Americans and their agents destroyed the USSR. The Masons have been guiding Russian history. Conspiratorial narratives tend to be all-encompassing, easily assimilating new data or plot points. For the conspiracist, conspiracy becomes the story of Russia, something of a postmodern national epic. The Russian conspiratorial narrative offers a story that always reaffirms Russia's role as the hero of history, while emphasizing its status as the world's victim or offended party. Russia is the eternal victim of a particular kind of hatred called Russophobia. The concept would seem to be straightforward. Those who argue that Russia's critics are guilty of Russophobia insist that a fundamental, irrational hatred towards Russia itself is the prime motivator. But accusations of Russophobia do not exist in a vacuum. They express at least as much about the accuser as the accused. Russophobia presupposes Russia as a victim of hostile forces, often conspiring against the motherland out of a desire for domination, destruction, or destabilization. These narratives of Russian victimhood play out within the melodramatic framework of large-scale conspiracy theories. Besides the obvious political utility, reflexively deflecting blame for anything with which the Russian state or government might be faulted, they also do important ontological work, establishing a relationship between self and other that starts to look suspiciously like a kind of mirroring. Consider Channel 1, the main state television in Russia. Channel 1's response to the news that Russian double agent Sergei Skripal may have been poisoned by Russian agents in England in 2018. The channel's director, monstrous sort of Voldemort imitator Dmitry Kiselyov, labeled London a death trap for Russians and speculated, if you think hard about it, only Britain stands to benefit from the poisoning of the GRU colonel, simply to nourish its Russophobia. The discourse of Russophobia locks Russia into a dyad with the perceived enemy, displacing actions and attributed initially to one party as a shared characteristic of both. This sharing is not simultaneous, but rather a timeshare. The accusation is passed back and forth like a football. In structure, the discourse of Russophobia resembles a narcissistic self-regard, manifesting a preoccupation with how Russia looks from an imagined external view. The presumption of hostility, rather than tearing down a sense of Russian greatness, reinforces it, using external animosity as a gauge of importance. This is why I think when Obama dismissed Russia as a second-rate former power, that was the most offensive thing he could have done. Not saying Russia is evil, but saying Russia is irrelevant. Conspiracy makes Russia relevant. As we look closer at the resurgence of the Russophobia discourse in the wake of the Soviet collapse, we see how closely tied it is to a sense of Russian precarity. In part as a response to the chaos of the 1990s, the culture of the Putin era is preoccupied with rectifying the problem of Russia's object impermanence. Years of entertaining the possibility of Russia's total destruction have been remedied by the continued reassertion of Russia's existence and its centrality on the world stage. And here the discourse of Russophobia has been crucial. Indeed, it is the demise of the Soviet Union, which both was and was not Russia for the purposes of how we talk about this. It is the demise of the USSR that makes Russophobia such a compelling idea. The Russophobia would not be routinely invoked by politicians and pundits in the 1990s. The first post-Soviet decade laid the groundwork for the concept's post-millennial appeal. The role of the 1990s is crucial. First, its experience and subsequent discursive construction as an era of total collapse inevitably led to a search for the culprits behind Russian misery. Second, the ongoing sense of collapse often manifested itself in a representation of a lost, vanishing, weak Russia, whose connection to Russophobia is something I explore. And finally, the chaos of the 1990s became the cornerstone of specifically post-Soviet conspiracy theories, nearly all of which we'll find in Russophobia, an easy framework. In the Putin era, we find a political culture that situates itself as post-catastrophic, the catastrophe being both 1991 and the Yeltsin years, when in the new narrative, the country narrowly avoided being torn apart by internal and external enemies. The subsequent prosperity did little to tamp down on conspiratorial thought. Rather, in the figure of Putin and the men around him, conspiratorial thinkers found either a Machiavellian demon who came to power by masterminding domestic terrorism and claiming credit for fighting against it, an idea given new life in 2012 by Masha Gessen in her biography of Putin, or the long-awaited hero who was powerful enough to stand against the conspirators. If under Yeltsin, conspiracy became a common language, under Putin, particularly after his return to the presidency in 2012, conspiracy is now a meta-language. One of the most brilliant moves of Putin and his supporters is to co-opt the language of conspiracy and falsification so thoroughly that all symbolic exchange of truth value collapses into false equivalencies. As the 2012 protest movement captured video after video of suspicious election activity, police brutality, and corruption, that is uncovering a state conspiracy to claim power through unlawful means, state television responded with charges that the falsification itself had been falsified. Here I should note the contrast between the way conspiratorial accusations are typically handled in the US and the way they're handled in Putin's Russia. In the States, the guiding principle, at least before Trump, was not to engage, because engaging simply feeds the beast. Hence the long months before Obama's final anticlimactic release of his long-form birth certificate. The Kremlin's response is to engage at all costs because feeding the beast is in the regime's best interest. It is here that conspiracy weds postmodernism to produce a particularly monstrous offspring. The very status of evidence is constantly undermined. Any report or even video of either the police violating people's rights or protesters getting violent is immediately declared a provocation by the other side. The Russian word provokatsiya is somewhat narrower than its English equivalent. It nearly always connotes an element of falseness. In other words, what looks like a crime is actually dirty tricks performed by the enemy. It is a false flag. Nowhere was this clearer than in the discussion of electoral fraud and AstroTurf protests around the 2012 elections. After repeated and filmed reports of shuttle buses bringing in ringers to vote repeatedly in precinct after precinct, the government responded with charges of similar tactics by the opposition. For years, critics of the regime have claimed and documented that a large proportion of any pro-government rally consists either of people who, in the best traditions of Soviet-era demonstrations, were forced to attend by their bosses at work, or who agreed to take part in exchange for cash. So naturally, state television now shows footage of anti-Putin demonstrators who claim to have been paid by liberals for their attendance and for their protest against the regime. Two television documentaries from this time highlight this new dynamic. First, there is the three-part mockumentary, Russia Total Eclipse, which, though broadcast on the state-controlled NTV channel, looks exactly like a typical muckraking NTV documentary. Hence, the director gives a seamless facade of utter seriousness as he takes the familiar tropes of the last few decades of conspiracy theory and claims to expose their actual truth. One part tells us about the secret cabal of homosexuals who control the media, another exposes the genetic basis of fascism, and all of them repeatedly invoke the Dulles Plan as established fact. This deliberate confusion of fact and fantasy, this was sort of like this is Spinal Tap of conspiracy theory, was the perfect commentary on today's media environment, in which truth claims can be so easily faked that fiction may as well be fact and fact fiction. Even more notorious is that Arkady Mamotov's Anatomy of a Protest. Here we discover that every move made by the protest movement has been funded by the US State Department and Georgian plutocrats, while every instance of police brutality is simply a provocation designed to produce the appearance of police brutality as a weapon against the regime. Even the footage of ballot stuffing turns out to be footage of a pre-election ballot casting exercise reconfigured by the treacherous protesters as evidence of vote tampering. Mamontov has turned the conspiracy documentary into his own personal art form. He is the Leni Riefenstahl of NTV, only without the talent. Not only can he be reliably expected to produce a scathing indictment of whoever might be the enemy du jour, he repeatedly demonstrates that all these various enemies are actually part of the same group, like the Legion of Doom banding together to fight the Justice League. From a conspiratorial viewpoint, this makes perfect sense. If we recall the lizard people and their friends, the elders of Zion, then does it really strain credibility to to maintain, as Momentov postulates, that LGBT advocates are directly linked to shadowy forces plotting to cede Russian territory to Ukraine. One might wonder what common cause gay rights activists could find with Ukraine, which, last I heard, is far from the Slavic equivalent of San Francisco. But Momentov's ingenuity is in turning the most far-fetched statements into something reassuringly familiar. As television, Momentov's documentaries are best viewed in the same light as the American Law and Order franchise. You think you're watching a brand new episode, but it always turns out to be the same old story. Indeed, Momentov's talent reveals itself precisely in this balance between the novel and the banal. The snippets of information may be new, but they are strung together in such a fashion as to remind you of their relationship to the conspiratorial master plot. Russia is both surrounded and infiltrated by enemies, and all of these enemies are working together. At this point, conspiracy reaches total semiotic overdrive, as well as becoming the perfect state of total simulation. Everything becomes conspiracy, including the attempt to expose conspiracy. The results for political and cultural discourse are unequivocally dismal. Recall the 2-year drama of Pussy Riot, the feminist punk actionist performance collective whose punk prayer in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior made them into an international cause célèbre, transforming its 2 imprisoned participants into prison reform advocates, and made people in my profession much sought after interlocutors and speakers after 2 post-Soviet decades of languishing in the basement of academia just waiting for someone to call. I bring up Pussy Riot not to rehash an episode that has been hashed and hashtagged within an inch of its life by many people, including me, but to point out the role played by the corrosive effect of conspiratorial thought. First, we have the constant Russian media speculations as to who is really behind Pussy Riot, a question made all the more pointed by the assumption that there is no way that a few girls could be the ones ultimately responsible. Culprits range from Pyotr Virzilov, who was married at the time to Nadia Tolokonnikova, the most photogenic of the defendants, to Georgian power broker Givy Targamadze, to not yet dead exiled oligarch Boris Berezovsky, and even Michael McFaul, the American ambassador to the Russian Federation. Second, we find the repeated attempts to follow the money, even in the absence of an obvious money trail. In the first interview with Tolokonnikova and her comrade in arms, Masha Alyokhina, a journalist insisted on trying to turn the conversation to the value of the Pussy Riot brand and plans to cash in. It is certainly possible that Alyokhina and Tolokonnikova are not as disinterested in wealth and fame as they claim to be, but the reflexive distrust of any explanation based entirely on personal, political, and aesthetic convictions is in itself quite telling. For all their artistic sophistication, Pussy Riot is staking a claim to sincerity, and such claims are completely incompatible with conspiracy. Information ceases to be mere information, if indeed it ever really was, and becomes a vector with a target, a weapon hurled either at a supposedly all-powerful evil enemy or the supposedly defenseless, naive information consumer. Critics of the media scene during Putin's 3rd and 4th terms, where the state's grip on the largest media outlets has grown stronger and more obvious in the past few years, posit an imaginary Russian media consumer, a post-Soviet couch potato whose gullibility helps the regime ruin the country. Hence the frequent accusation that so-called patriots and the majority of the population that allegedly supports Putin are victims of what in Russian is called zombification, zombirovание, which is the equivalent of the English brainwashing. As opposition leader Boris Nemtsov asserted only 2 months before his assassination, zombifying people is the main attribute of Putin's regime. Putin, in turn, hurls the same accusation at the supporters of Maidan in Ukraine, essentially conflating crowds at a street protest with the proverbial zombie hordes. In both cases, the primary tool for zombification is said to be television, the zombie box, which is the Russian equivalent of the boob tube. The zombie box is the key strategic and rhetorical weapon in the information war. There are few terms that smack more of propaganda than information war, with propaganda perhaps being one of them. Like most violent conflicts, information wars are not formally declared. Instead, they're called into existence through a variety of performative incantations. Not a declaration of information war, but a declaration that the other side is already engaging in an information war and that it is incumbent on our side to fight back. Thus, the entire Putinist media apparatus constantly tells its audience that the West, in slandering Russia, is conducting an information war. Meanwhile, in Germany, Great Britain, and the United States, neo-Cold War hawks demand the revival of mid-20th century soft power strategies and, more important, soft power budgets in order to combat the trumped-up threat of the Russian Federation's hilariously entertaining foreign television service, RT, formerly Russia Today. The advocates of information war are happily ensconced in their own informational feedback loop. RT's director, Margarita Simanyan, shamelessly inflates the stats showing her network's effective reach, and Euro-American hawks are only too willing to believe her. The allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 and 2020 American presidential elections have only added fuel to the fire, despite the obvious fact that RT itself, with its relatively small reach and constant pandering to the lunatic fringe, could not have played a significant role in the outcome. Simanyan herself flatly denies the accusation of interference and propaganda, but like the internet trolls who retweet her network stories, she clearly enjoys the attention. Conspiracy is the perfect discursive framework for the attention economy, keeping everyone glued to their screens to find more and more confirmation that the enemy is out to get them. The sky is falling, and everyone under it couldn't be happier about it. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Eliot. And I see Michael at his post. You want to continue with your response, Michael? And then we...
Yep. Okay, so first of all, good evening. And I have to say it's an honor and a pleasure to respond to this. And this is, of course, so rich that I hardly know where to begin, especially since I'm not at all an expert on Russia, apart from the fact that I have some family relations. Let's say there are members of my extended family that mostly consume Russian media, even though they're living in Germany, which makes conversation sometimes difficult. I have to say the worst thing that happened was all the revelations about doping in Russian sports, because so far I could at least talk to my father-in-law about sports and we could watch that together. And then that went away because of all these revelations. And so, well, but I'm playing for time because I'm still organizing my thoughts. I thought you were talking for a little bit longer, so I wasn't quite ready yet, but that's fine. I maybe want to begin by something that was only implicit in what you said now, but that comes to the fore very much in your book, because I think since we're being guests at an Institute of Literary Studies and we're both at the end of the day scholars of literature, this is something we may also want to pick up at some point, that's the importance of the literary imagination of fiction for conspiracy theories and actually throughout history. I mean, we all know about the protocols of the Elders of Zion and that they're partly based on a German novel. But even before that, if we go to the beginning of modern conspiracism in the aftermath of the French Revolution, with writers like Augustin Barruel and Johann August Stark, who accused the Freemasons and the Illuminati of having plotted the destruction of the French government and are now continuing to plot the destruction of all of Europe and the United States. The funny thing is that both of them first wrote novels about that before they published their pamphlets. And you can draw from there a line throughout history, and you see the same pattern again and again. So, for example, Helen Nestor Webster, whose influence on the development of what Michael Barkun calls super conspiracy theories can hardly be underestimated, because she's basically the first one in the first decades of the 20th century to merge the threat of the Illuminati with the threat of the Jews and the threat of communism, and influences people like Ezra Pound and Winston Churchill with that. Before she writes historical treatises, she writes historical novels about the French Revolution. So there again, we have this move from fiction to historiography. And I'm never sure if it is that people, while writing fiction, discover something that they never thought was possible when they're doing their historical research, or if they're trying out something in fiction that they don't quite dare yet to say in a non-fictional discourse. And for those of you who are well versed with the German conspiracy theory community, even somebody like Paul Schreier, a famous German 9/11 conspiracy theorist, first wrote a novel about 9/11 together with his father before he published his journalistic work on 9/11, proving that it was all, of course, the American government, or at least that we don't really know. have a couple of slides to share because I want to say a little bit about the US, because I thought we could then talk about how this really relates to the American case. And I want to introduce, while doing that, a slightly different terminology, and that is one that tries to capture the status of knowledge that conspiracy theories occupy. So if we go to the sociology of knowledge, then something that I found very productive is the distinction between orthodox and heterodox knowledge. Orthodox knowledge being a knowledge that is commonly accepted as legitimate knowledge, that is shared and believed by epistemic authorities, by intellectual leaders, by religious leaders, by the established media, and by science. And of course, heterodox knowledge being what Foucault would call subjugated knowledges, knowledge that appears illegitimate, that might not be entirely unpopular. Sometimes it's very popular, like belief in magic or certain other forms of superstition, but that you don't really score points with in academia, that you don't find in serious newspapers, and for which there is no place in serious political discourse. I mean, one of the things that we have learned about the US, or understood about the US in recent years, is that, and that probably goes for most of Europe and probably also for Russia as well to a certain degree, and that's what I would be interested in discussing, is that for a very long time it was very normal to believe in conspiracy theories and articulate conspiracy theories. So basically every American president, one could say, from George Washington in the 1790s to Eisenhower in the 1950s, was a conspiracy theorist. Washington was concerned about a British plot against the colonies. His successor, John Adams, was concerned about the Illuminati plot against the United States. Thomas Jefferson also believed in the British plot. Abraham Lincoln was concerned with the slave power conspiracy plot. And Eisenhower, of course, like many others at that time, believed in a communist plot, the so-called Red Scare of the 1950s. And people like McCarthy, of course, were not really fringe characters, but McCarthy in many ways was just the tip of the iceberg, something like the most outspoken among a broad cultural consensus for a while. And this all changes then during the 1960s in many ways, because during the 1950s, Congress debates how to counter the communist conspiracy. Basically every second week they pass laws to do that. 10 years later, it's only the right-wing extremists of the John Birch Society who believe that there is a large-scale Russian plot against, or Soviet plot against, the United States. So conspiracy theories really shift their status from orthodox to heterodox knowledge. And as Katharina Thalmann has shown in a wonderful book about the stigmatization of conspiracy theories that came out in 2019, this really has a lot to do with the popularization of insights from the social sciences. So she identifies three waves in which social scientists basically disqualify conspiracy theories and define them as problematic, and therefore also as an object of study. And you see Richard Hofstadter in the column on the right. So I think the really interesting thing about Katharina's work is that she shows that there's a long prehistory to what Hofstadter did. So for example, the term paranoid style first emerges in Adorno's authoritarian personality, and Hofstadter may have gotten it from there, or maybe he didn't know that he got it from there. What connects these three waves is that this disqualification of conspiracy theory basically happens from two different sources. On the one hand, there is what you could call the Frankfurt School of Conspiracy Theory Studies that argues that conspiracy theories are dangerous because these are people in exile looking at Europe and seeing what one specific conspiracy theory, that of the Jewish world conspiracy, is, what harmful consequences it is having, leading to the Holocaust. And secondly, there is the more sociological, epistemological approach that we could associate with somebody like Popper, who argues that conspiracy theories are just bad explanations of social reality because they always overestimate intentions and underestimate other causes and effects. And as Thalmann argues, this kind of becomes popularized and common knowledge, and therefore leads to a disqualification of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories don't really become unpopular, but what happens is that they are no longer accepted as official orthodox knowledge. You heard earlier during my introduction that I'm currently directing a project that looks at the connection between populism and conspiracy theory, which is really difficult to study because we find that Hungary and Poland, for example, are very different cases from the US or Italy or Austria, for the very reason that there it's absolutely normal to believe in conspiracy theories. And of course, the reasons that are offered for that are usually the reasons that are also offered for why we find this in post-Soviet Russia, and that is the experience of a highly secretive, conspiring communist government, and also, of course, the transformations of the 1990s. I think we can add to that a third factor, and that is the systematic oppression of the social sciences that we had in these communist countries, because, of course, they were seen as bourgeois pseudosciences challenging the pure Marxist doctrine. What we also observe, however, by looking at Poland and Hungary is something that Eliot captured with a mainstreaming of conspiracy theories. So there is obviously at some point during the 1990s or even in the early 2000s in all of these countries, a movement where conspiracy theories move from the margins back into the official channels, where the parties in power or the people in power become more explicitly conspiracist in what they're saying. And something that we're trying to figure out at the moment, and this is something I would love to hear Eliot's opinion on, is if this move from the margins to the mainstream also has something to do with another shift in the status of these conspiracy theories, if they are orthodox knowledge all along, and it's just that the people in power don't need them for a while, and then they begin to draw on them even more again. Another thing that we see in the US, of course, at the moment is that we see something like a fragmentation of the public sphere when it comes to conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories have become more important in the US again. They have made a comeback in the US again, but it's not that they are entirely unchallenged. These days, unlike Obama, you may feel the need to respond to them immediately, but that doesn't mean that you buy into their premises. So there are still many people around in both parties, actually, that don't believe in conspiracy theories, even though one party is more and more coming under the spell of conspiracy theories. So a fragmentation that ran along different lines than the one between Democrats and Republicans is more and more now becoming a parallel to this, with all the problematic respects. But in a way, what we see is that we have in the United States a part of the public that worries about conspiracy theories, and we have one that really worries about conspiracies. And this seems to me to be one major difference to Russia, where basically even the opposition employs the language of conspiracy theory to criticize the government. So in a way, there are the people who worry about these kinds of conspiracies and the people who worry about other kinds of conspiracies, but there doesn't seem to be this challenge to conspiracy theory as a category, if I'm not entirely mistaken. And the last point I want to make is one that I also find interesting, because I'm trying to work to think about this in relation to populism at the moment, and that is something that the political scientists Rosenblum and Moorhead have called the new conspiracism. Conspiracy without the theory. You just make a bold claim in a tweet. You could also say something like a conspiracy rumor. And they say this has not really something to do with populism. I think it has to do with populism in that my hunch is that people like Trump and other populist leaders have been using this because they have to cater to dual audiences. They have to cater to people who believe in conspiracy theories, but they still also have to cater to people who don't believe in conspiracy theories, more traditional Republicans, one could say. And therefore, if you don't spell it all out, it's more easy to be dismissed. We see this in Germany, for example, if you look at the rhetoric of certain AfD politicians like Björn Höcke. If they give a 10-minute speech, there will be 2 or 3 moments where they signal to people who believe in conspiracy theories, I'm with you. One of my PhD students who's looking at this calls this Verschwörungstheoretische Zuspitzung, conspiracist condensation. But the rest of the speech is maybe in many ways problematically racist and xenophobic and whatever, but it's not outspokenly conspiracist. And I'm wondering if we see anything similar happening in Russia, or if you would see a connection to what you call the use of conspiracy memes in public discourse in Russia. And final point, RT, which is one of my major sources for the research I do on the German conspiracy theory community, because I would agree with you that the impact of RT is greatly exaggerated, but it is of very high strategic use to, for example, German conspiracy theorists, because it helps them to build up their claims of authority, because they can claim that they are actually being interviewed by a real TV station. And they, of course, always hold RT against publicly funded broadcasting in Germany. And they say, well, they all say it's Russian propaganda, but of course, in Germany, this is also all state-owned propaganda, and all the usual suspects of the German conspiracy theory community, Daniele Ganser, Markus Fiedler, Dirk Pohlmann, and all the others, they will all make regular appearances at RT, which then feed back into their own discourse. And that's it actually from me. And now I think we can jump right into that, because I think we have so much food for thought that we won't get bored during the next hour and a half or so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I knew that you would be able to make the implications of my talk much more coherent than I myself did. So I learned a lot about what I was saying from listening to you. And I do apologize for flat-footing you by not speaking as long as you expected. As you know, in the United States, we have this kind of notion of the 40-minute talk, which I think is kind of like the 40-minute therapy hour. And it's just ingrained into us, and going over it means that someone's going to start yelling at you, or you're going to be that Russian speaker who just doesn't care and is going to go on for an hour and a half, which is another thing. So anyway, sorry for that. But to go through your points, because I was taking notes. So about literature and conspiracy, I think you're absolutely right. And this is something I talk about a lot in the book. But the basic idea that I'm trying to make here, which I didn't really talk about in the talk, is that I think this is sort of following up on a whole Derridian thing, but without all the Derridian, stuff. That in order to come up with conspiratorial ideas as part of a political discourse, what I think we first do, or where we first learn it, is through fiction and storytelling. It's a nice coincidence in English that plot means both conspiracy and, of course, the plot of a narrative, but that narratives teach us a bunch of things. Narratives teach us that everything's connected, because if you're consuming a narrative and everything isn't connected, what's going on? This is a terrible story, even though life isn't like that. So narratives encourage us to see patterns, and a good reader finds the patterns, right? It's all terrible training for life, but great training for other things. So there is a way, it's first as play, then as serious, right? And so the examples you gave are wonderful. I would add Whitney Schreiber, who wrote novels about alien abduction, then claimed he was an alien abductee and went on with this. It does seem to happen an awful lot. And I would guess that it's that they're not setting out first to do this in fiction and then in the novels, but that they get, more and more consumed by what they're thinking about, or there could be a cynical element, one never knows. But that absolutely there is I think a straight line or a set of connections between fictional entertainment and how we understand conspiracy. And it's not just that so much of our fictional entertainment has conspiracies, although there is that as well. In terms of the reasons that in the post-Soviet space you have so much conspiratorial thinking, obviously people do turn to the oppressive nature of the regimes, as I myself invoked a number of points in the talks, and I think that is a lot of it, but it's not all, at least in the case of Russia. And here I'm going to say things that I would never say in print because I can't back them up, but that I think on an experiential level makes sense to me. That is that there's a long tradition in Russian thought, and I think in Russian conversational habits among educated people, to look for connections, to make grand narratives, and to theorize. The ability of educated Russians to come up with a theory and stick to it, at least for a little while, is kind of awe-inspiring to an outsider. So I'd say there's something about it that has to do with simply the rhetorical style of conversation, the rhetorical style of thought, that I think is not just about the Soviet experience. And I can't say whether or not that is true in say, Poland or Hungary. I don't know much about that. In terms of whether or not conspiracy theory was orthodox all along, whether it's heterodox, there's a book that just came out that I think addresses this fairly well. It's very grounded in the social sciences. Scott Radnitz's book, I'll remember the title in a minute, but it's all about conspiracy in the post-Soviet space, and he looks at a few different case studies. And he finds, not surprisingly, that it's both orthodox and heterodox. You bring up how in the United States there's a lot of fragmentation about conspiracy. That is, right now we have one party that is really seems to be all in for conspiracy, and one that seems to be against it and yet really got obsessed with the whole Russia narrative, right? That suggests there is a way in which the left can also be into this, but much more allergic to being seen as being conspiratorial. I don't think there's that much fragmentation in Russia. I think that for a long time, this kind, as I was saying, this kind of connection making has been legitimate. And in connection with the near destruction of the social sciences that you alluded to, and the rebirth of the social sciences, sadly, has, after several years of independence, has turned into basically just nothing but churning out regime supporting pseudoscience. All of this leads to the position that I was elaborating before and elaborating in the book, that that conspiracy theory becomes everybody's language. Now, you could believe or disbelieve in certain theories, but it's really the air people are breathing. Now, you bring up what I talked about in the book about conspiracy memes, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because my talk was all about grand conspiracy theories and narratives. But one of the points that I really like to make is that when we think only in terms of the grand narratives, there's a problem, that there's a kind of stigmatization that's going on that's not about whether or not people are paranoid, but the idea that the people who believe in conspiracy are all in all the time and therefore are not like us, right? But if you go back to the point I was trying to make about fiction, and the way in which we're watching an episode of X-Files or whatever, and we believe the conspiracy for the moment, we're all totally capable of temporarily assuming what I call a conspiratorial stance. And so when you talk about people signaling that they're with you and all that, I think that has a lot to do with how conspiracy plays out in Russia and elsewhere, as not just the grand narrative, that people in various situations will be completely comfortable being the subject of an utterance that is conspiratorial and then moving on to something else. And that doesn't, you can be the subject of a conspiratorial utterance without completely committing to conspiracy theory. And I think this is also where we as overeducated intellectuals have this bias towards logic, and towards the idea that people come by their political views and their worldview in a logical fashion, when actually I think we start with emotion and then we back it up with what we think of as logic. And so it's perfectly possible to entertain a conspiratorial notion in a moment, but not really necessarily completely commit yourself to it. And this then goes back to what's going on state television, right? I mean, one of the big questions people ask, and the questions people ask about in the Republican Party right now, and people who are anti-Trump are now pro-Trump, do they really believe this nonsense? And on one level, that's a very important question. On another level, it's not, right? What they're doing is, at the moment they're spouting the nonsense, they are the expositor of that nonsense, and therefore, in that instance, that's them. And I think we make a mistake when we want people to be coherent subjects, and when we look for sincerity. Sincerity, I think, is overrated and harder to find, and a very, very Protestant. And so, forget it. Finally, on RT, I really liked what you're saying about the use of RT in among conspiratorial circles in Germany. It makes perfect sense, especially when you talk about public funding. And I think that's one of the reasons that RT, while it plays a role in American conspiratorial circles, definitely, still doesn't have that overall role in the ecosystem, because it's not compared to state-funded television. We have PBS, no one watches PBS. That's about it. Now you have the ideas that all the networks are really working for the CIA and all that, but that takes a step. That's a further step down a conspiratorial road than simply acknowledging that the state owns BBC or whatever, right? And so that, in fact, the stigmatization of RT as state news, as the news sponsored by Russia, is easier to perform in America than it might be in a country, I think, where you have accept the idea that a lot of your state television channels are supported by the state.
There are questions coming in from our audience, and I'd love to bring them in. The first one comes from Gleb Kazakov, and he says, Eliot, could you comment on the connection between the rise of conspiracy theories in Russia and the decrease of popular respect for the humanities and academic professions in general? Is there a connection at all?
There a connection? So I would say less about Russia than in general. That one argument that humanists like to make, and I'm not sure how true it is, but it's one that makes us feel really, really good, is that the proliferation of conspiracy theories should be used as evidence for why we need to get people to study the humanities. That is why we need to get people to understand a story, to understand how persuasion works, and that is just as important as STEM, that is as science, technology, and math. And I like to think it's true, but it also has that, there's, at least in the American academic system, there's this perennial science envy that happens in the humanities. Science gets the money, science gets the attention, we start to shrink more, so we look for reasons. So I can't help but think that there's probably something to it, but I'm also persuaded by how easy it is for my students to be in my classes, hear me talk, and by the end of the semester, they haven't learned anything. So I think I'd like to think education is the answer, but I just don't know.
There are two further questions from David Schwartz, and he says, first one, are there also contemporary conspiracy theories in Russia that are directed against their homegrown powers, or are they all directed against evil external influences? Interesting point. And the second one, what role does literature or films, TV series play in the development of new conspiracy theories in Russia today?
Okay, so the first one, yes, certainly. So there are theories there's certainly theories about the regime itself. The main one, which has some evidence behind it, is that Putin came to power by engineering the bombings of apartment buildings when he was prime minister and acting president, and that this was all part of a sort of false flag operation to get people to be afraid of terrorists and then to support him. And maybe, I don't know. I don't have the evidence. I'm not really equipped to do that. And in general, of course, this whole rhetoric of zombification, of brainwashing, always involves the regime. So it is the regime that is the problem. Now, in terms of other homegrown forces, certainly, but the problem is that these homegrown forces are almost immediately identified as connected to the outside. In fact, that is really part of the issue here, is to make it look like a homegrown, like from the regime's point of view, to make it look like any sort of homegrown movement, opposition, for instance, or even a fascist movement, that those aren't native to the Russian Federation. People aren't joining them just because they have these opinions, but because it's being funded by the State Department, by Jews, by whoever. So it's an important important way to discredit opposition by connecting it to the outside. So the impulse to look outside is very powerful. Literature. Well, yes, absolutely. What's in the 90s, there are all of these novels that I've read, mostly really bad, that I've read and talk about, that posit how, in this total chaos, we need someone to come in and have a firm hand and bring this country back. Now, and that person could come to power through conspiratorial means, and that will be okay. Now, does that predict Putin? Does that help Putin get in? Well, maybe. It's also kind of obvious, right? So I don't know where the chicken or the egg thing really fits in there, except that it's not surprising that literature will reflect this. And literature is going to reflect this more than television and film, because as the grip on the media increased over the past 20 years, the attention was primarily to the mass media. And for the most part, writers of fiction were ignored as irrelevant and could get away with saying more. So you'd actually find, and have less of an influence, because in fact they are writers of fiction. So you will find this more in the printed word, and of course on YouTube, everywhere on YouTube, just like around the world.
maybe I can jump in there and pick up on this literature fiction thing, because I wanted to do that earlier anyway. And I think that, I mean, one of the lectures I did in recent years that I most enjoyed was about the parallels between conspiracy theorists and literary critics.
Yes.
Because if you take Barkun's criteria, nothing is as it seems, nothing happens by accident, and everything is connected. I mean, this is in a way very often what we teach our students about literature. You have to take the passage on page 3 and connect it to what's happening in the second sentence on page 237. Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death isn't really about death, but it's about marriage, and it's not what you thought it was, but there's a hidden layer of meaning. And of course, this has all been planned, maybe not by the author anymore and his or her intentions, but it is the text that does that, because the text is a coherent thing. So in that regard, I can relate very much to what you're saying about how fiction teaches us to connect the dots, to see the patterns, and I think literary critics are just particularly good at that. At the same time, I wanted to bring something in, kind of tying it to your last answer just now, that in Germany there is, and I see that on social media because of some of the people that I follow, not so much among scholars who study conspiracy theories, but among, one could, I'm tempted to call them pseudo-scholars, you could also call them semi-scholars, people who are now more working for NGOs, activists, a growing concern about representations of conspiracy in TV shows and movies, as if this is teaching people how the world works and making them more receptive to conspiracy theories. And I think it's all more complicated, because I really like your point about that. In a way, in fiction, we kind of see things through the eye. We can assume a subject position that is not usually ours. And I think Tim Melly captures this when he says fiction is a non-serious discourse. We all go to the cinema and give into the illusion that the Illuminati are ruling the world for 2 hours. But that doesn't mean that afterwards we search the internet for signs that the Illuminati are really ruling the world. So I'm wondering what your take on that is, also with regard to the US, because I mean, basically every American TV show, of course, has a conspiracy plot somewhere, because that just allows you to move the plot forward, to balance the episodic and the serial, to take it into new directions when it has reached a dead end. So it's for storytelling reasons, but I see a growing concern about this in Germany, and I'm getting worried about that, because they might take my TV shows away.
We wouldn't want that. I never want to take my TV shows away, especially now. What do we have besides TV shows? I mean, this is who knew how dependent we were going to be? We're all in little TV screens right now. I completely agree with you with your take on this, especially with literary criticism. Absolutely. Every now and then I just want to say, well, this is probably just a mistake, or this is just something random in the text, and we are trained not to do that, right? I console myself about it in that I try to make some parallels with how I feel about Freud, right? That I'm very happy to use Freud to sometimes, not all the time, to analyze the product of a human consciousness rather than a human consciousness itself, because I see Freud as another product of human consciousness. That is, I don't want to go to analysis, but I would use the analysis on something that was produced by someone. And so the fact that we're dealing with artifacts, with literary artifacts, I think does encourage us to assume either like real intent or this kind of displaced intent that the new critics give us, right? That the text itself is doing it. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that as long as we're aware of it. This goes back to sort of this Derridian double thing again, like, you know, you can't get rid of it, but you should know the structure that has trapped you. If you know the structure has trapped you, then you at least have a fighting chance. In terms of television shows, I agree with you that, you know, you go to see a movie about the Illuminati, chances are most people are not going to go out and research Illuminati. Someone will, right? But then, you know, are we really going to try to child-proof or, you know, crazy-proof every culture production? What I do think is probably likely true, but I could never prove it, is that the sheer volume of conspiratorial stories encourage people not to believe in a particular conspiracy, but maybe to be ready to believe in a conspiratorial point of view. That is, you've rehearsed it enough. There's also a way in which even like being exposed even to things you don't believe again and again, it leaves a mark. I remember I was aware of this in the 2008 election, the 2016 election, that, so with Hillary Clinton, right? I never believed any of the conspiracy theories about Hillary Clinton. I didn't believe she killed Vince Foster. I don't believe she's drinking baby's blood, any of this. But still, I found myself not trusting her. And then I asked myself, why don't I trust her? Well, I don't trust any of the politicians, fine, but what is it about her? And what I think it is not so much her, but 20 years of hearing this right-wing nonsense about her that I don't believe, still finally kind of left something in the back of my mind that, well, there's something sketchy about her. I think the sheer repetition can do that. But in that case, I mean, that's like years and years of concerted propaganda and not, going to a couple of movies.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that it's, I think, the repeated exposure over a long period of time, because I mean, there are some psychological studies that want to make us believe that if you only hear about a conspiracy theory once, you're already getting kind of infected with that. And I think that is utter nonsense. And that might make sense if you do these things with questionnaires with your undergraduates who are trying to figure out what you want to hear, but not when you're dealing with real people. But what you're saying reminds me of a point that I think Michael Denning makes in one of his earliest books, the one on the British spy thriller from the 1980s, where he also says that, yeah, if we can only imagine the relationships between countries as conspiratorial, then it's maybe because popular fiction has told us that this is what they usually are, because we have all of these narratives about agents. So in a way, he's making the big argument where you made the small argument about Hillary Clinton. And I think there's something to be said about that, even though at the same time, I think that if you look closely at many of these TV shows, for example, they're also highly self-reflexive in many ways, that they reflect on their own, very much like New Hollywood, right? That they reflect on the paranoia that they're also trying to create. If you think of the first season of Homeland, if you think of the first season of Berlin Station, if you think of other TV shows like Lost, for example, where it's always about who is right and who not, and why would you believe that? And so I think they're more complex than they are very often credited with by people who want to take them away from us.
And actually, why would you believe that? Yeah. The other thing here, that all of this is about genre, right? I mean, you believe a conspiracy theory, watching a conspiracy show. We've all had the experience of, I think, of watching a movie about a haunted house, right? And some idiot goes back inside the haunted house. Yeah. And you want to say, no, don't go back.
I'll be right back. Yeah.
Right, I'll be right back. Right? And I don't believe in haunted houses or anything like that. But I know if I'm in one of those movies, I'm not going back to the haunted house, right? So within that framework, why wouldn't you believe in the haunting, right? It's the idiots in those stories who are saying, even though this is happening right before my very eyes, it's not happening because I'm a rationalist, and that means you're going to be killed in the next scene. Which that's the fictional part. Then there's the part in so-called reality, whatever you want to call it, which is, I think, one of the hardest things for talking about conspiracy theories that makes it so destabilizing is sometimes conspiracy theories are true, right? There are conspiracy, and as I say this, I can imagine people go, uh-oh, what is he going to talk about now, right? But I mean, there have been conspiracies in the world, and so by taking what is my default position of skepticism towards conspiracy can make me incredibly vulnerable and naive. And so part of the problem is how we define ourselves in relation to the conspiracy theory. There's that phrase that you've probably heard 1,000 times, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. I would turn it around. Just because they're out to get you doesn't mean you're not paranoid. Right? So these two things are not really connected. And so this is something that I think we have real trouble grappling with.
But I think it really very much depends on your definition of conspiracy theory, which you, for reasons I can very well understand, sidestep in the book. Because I think that one thing that really distinguishes conspiracy theories from real conspiracies is the sheer number of connections that they make, and also the way they're being revealed. So real conspiracies tend to be revealed gradually. if you think of Watergate, whereas conspiracy theories, because you start with the question who benefits, cui bono, it's all there from the very beginning. And there's interesting work, I mean, you're no doubt familiar with that, but not everybody who's watching might be, and that is the work by Tim Tangolini, this computational folklorist from somewhere in California, who has mapped this, real conspiracies and conspiracy theories. And the interesting thing is, he kind of confirms Barkun. Something Barkun came up with as a theory 20 years ago. He, by connecting the dots, how things are revealed, when they are revealed, by which actors are supposed to be involved, and making these graphs that he can do these days with the methods of digital humanities, you end up with that. So I would always agree that there are gray cases where it's difficult to say, is it a conspiracy theory or conspiracy? But I think there are also a lot of cases where the real conspiracies are very different from the conspiracy theories that that we're all mostly concerned with here.
Sure, but I wonder why a conspiracy theory has to be defined about as being something that's not about a real conspiracy. Because you know, the example I give in my book is being in the Soviet Union and reading in a Soviet newspaper about how Ronald Reagan was selling arms to the Contras arms to Iran to fund the Contras. And I just thought that was crazy because there were so many connections, right? And of course, Ronald Reagan hates Iran, wants to support the Contras. It's all connected. It sounds, and you know, who benefits? It's all clear. It sounds ridiculous. It also was true, and no one cared. No one cared the real one. No one ever cares about the real ones. But I would say, you know, Iran-Contra, I mean, the theory didn't exist before the information came out, I assume. But, you know, talking about why isn't Iran-Contra a conspiracy theory about a real conspiracy?
Yeah, I mean, that's just purely a definitional question. And I've been talking a lot lately to analytical philosophers, and they say that basically this distinction that Brian Keeley made between warranted and unwarranted conspiracy theories is one that can no longer be maintained because it just doesn't really work. So we should drop the theory, not the theory, the category, the concept, the term altogether.
I mean, I wonder, Michael, in which way your differentiation between conspiracies on the one hand and conspiracy theories on the other hand has to do with a major claim you make. And my impression is that Eliot won't buy to it. And that's, you say that conspiracy theories are about providing knowledge, right? Revealing something and telling people the truth, whereas if I got it right, the situation that Eliot describes is a totally different one, which is, at least with relation to Russia, is the entire thing is a battle for attention, right? And the monopoly of defining things. And so what's interesting is information, which is a totally different thing than knowledge. Yeah, you were talking about information, you were talking about knowledge, and information means narrative elements free to recombine. That was your definition, and that's the matter you use, right, to create successful stories that then, you know, attract people's attention and give you a position to continue and see what you do with it, right? So Eliot, your talk is not about knowledge at all, right?
My talk is about claims to knowledge, right? I think that I would thread the needle here in that I agree with what Michael's talking about, but the situation I'm talking about here is that what is functioning here is that the claims to knowledge are part of the conspiracy theory, which is about spreading information. Without the claim to revealing knowledge, you don't have anything. But actual knowledge and receipt of knowledge, for my purposes, is not relevant. For other purposes, obviously, it is.
Yeah, it's I think this seems to be one of the differences there, and I think it's connected to the fact that conspiracy theories are far more widely accepted in Russia than they are in Germany, for example. So this is really about a competition of knowledges. But at the same time, I would now say that maybe I overdid that a little bit in the book, and that because another group of people I've been talking to a lot lately are Africanists who are beginning to study conspiracy theories, and their claim is that in Africa, in most African countries, if we can generalize to a certain degree, you don't really have this clear distinction between heterodox and orthodox knowledge. So you wouldn't have a Foucauldian regime of truth. And therefore, it's a whole different ball game. And therefore, usually, very often, conspiracy theories are not so interesting with regard to their content, not what they are about, but what they allow you to do, what they articulate. So distrust of somebody. It's not important what you accuse somebody of, but that you articulate your distrust of people. And I think that is also true to conspiracy theories in Germany to a certain degree. I think these functions can overlap, and it might also be true, I think, for conspiracy theories in Russia, I would assume.
And there's one other function that I think is being revealed, and it's probably always been there, but it's being revealed so clearly by QAnon, which is the community building function of conspiracy theory. I mean, QAnon goes through Facebook. QAnon is kind of is Facebook, right? I mean, QAnon has become this this online community largely for baby boomers. And what happened, and a lot of them from serious Christian backgrounds. But what you see when you read about them and hear people talk is their sense of like finding people they can talk with. And this is important too. They're online talking to each other. They're not always talking about QAnon. It's sort of like going to church. You go to church and then you talk about something else too. They have friends in QAnon, and this is more like a new religious community. With QAnon, it's quite clear. But I do wonder if extreme cases like QAnon, if we can take something from them and then move them back to less extreme ones and ask ourselves, how much of this is about community building. I'm not sure how much it is in Russia, and I don't know how much it is in Germany.
I think it is. I mean, Mark Fenster has a chapter on it in his book, which first came out in 1999 and then the second edition 2008, where he talks about the early days of the internet, the times of Usenet, and how the conspiracy theory community tries to figure out what happened to this journalist who was found dead in his hotel room, Danny Casolaro or something that's his name. So I think this has been around, but I think it's also been underestimated. And I think this is really important. The PhD student I mentioned earlier, I mean, she studies these right-wing social movements like Pegida, the Patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Western world. And she says it's very much about the community feeling. People come and they come for 10 minutes, they talk to people and then they leave again. So this has been underestimated because there is a tendency still and this has actually been gotten worse again through the pandemic, to absolutely vilify and demonize and other people who believe in conspiracy theories. And this is not at all helpful because all the distinctions disappear. There are many conspiracy theories that are really problematic. There are conspiracy theories that are really dangerous and that need to be contained. But there are also lots of them who are not at all dangerous and who are only becoming more and more radical because they're not. Yeah, you don't need to take them seriously, but as Mark Fenster also says, very often conspiracy theories are distorted responses to real anxieties and grievances. And this is something that has completely disappeared from the discussion because the media tend to focus on the completely absurd one like QAnon, people drinking babies' blood, and therefore we don't need to take any conspiracy theories serious in that we ask, well, what might be motivating them?
And then also
could you comment on the impression that conspiracy theory is to a certain extent a male genre? I want because all the people you quoted, right, were of male genre, and you mentioned the particular role of Pussy Riot, and that struck me because that was something very disturbing. I mean, you owe to them your rebirth as an expert with knowledge, which is requested, right?
Yes.
But above that.
So, I mean, I think there's if you want to oversimplify in a way I'm not comfortable with, but I'm going to do anyway, there is a way in which the kind of holding forth at great length, one is a common sort of Russian discursive practice, but also a fairly common masculine practice, the need to sort of show off what you know. But I mean, there are plenty of videos I've seen in Russia of seemingly crazy Russian women spouting conspiracy theories, no doubt. But I think as with all of these things, the men are getting more attention. In the US, though, I would say QAnon does not look that way. QAnon does not look all male by any means. QAnon is family friendly, except for the blood drinking stuff. that's where, and I think that's where some of the anxiety comes in, when you actually see people who look like, normal soccer moms or housewives or whatever you want to put it, buying into this. We're used to sort of crazy, disheveled men. But when it's not them, the women in the media, I see the women getting featured more and more, I think, precisely as, look, they look just like us, and here's what they believe.
I think it has a lot to do with QAnon, on which platforms the theories were spread. So when it was 4chan and 8chan, I think it was a predominantly male thing. And I have a BA student who's writing a thesis at the moment about how Instagram accounts have been using QAnon to appeal to women by highlighting the suffering of children. And it's a very different aesthetics, visual, and also different rhetoric. I mean, in general, we know from a couple of studies, and for Germany, that's particularly true, that men tend to believe more in conspiracy theories than women. But when it comes to medical conspiracy theories, the distinctions disappear. And I think, next to what Eliot already pointed out, that men like to show off their knowledge, I think this also has to do with that many conspiracy theories, as they have been circulating in the Western world in the past decades, are distorted, wrong, but responses to social transformations that have affected the position of men in society. So if you think of all New World Order conspiracy theories, they are obviously responses to globalization, which has taken jobs away from white men without a college degree in the Midwest, and have to put them into other countries. So this traditional masculine role of the protector and provider is one that you can no longer perform that well, because you earn less money, and therefore, and you explain this the loss of this position through conspiracy theories. And there we would have one of the real social causes. I mean, there's no need excusing the racism and sexism of the conspiracy theories that many of these people have embraced. But what is true is that before Trump came along, they had been neglected by both parties for decades, and nobody cared about them. And therefore, this turn to conspiracy theories is somewhat logical, because the idea that there is a plot where you don't figure, where nobody ascribes any importance to you, is not at all unfounded then.
And also that to the extent that the traditional gender divide obtains, men, I think, are just much more vulnerable. Their identities are much more vulnerable when they lose a job.
Yeah.
Whereas women in this traditional sphere, they have the home, and it's not so weird for them to be at home. The men are much more at a loss.
Yeah, and of course, notions of femininity are usually far more tied also to the body. So if you ask people, I mean, how do you lose your femininity? It's because if you can't bear children, if you have cancer and you lose a breast, whereas you lose your masculinity, people tell you in polls, if you lose your job.
Yeah. And then in terms of women spreading conspiracy theory, I mean, you mentioned Instagram, and I think what we're starting to see is that as women have taken on such prominent roles as influencers, as bloggers, and so on and so forth, the Goops of the world and all of that really feeds in very nicely into a particular, feminized form of conspiracy theory, like, Jenny McCarthy and the autism and vaccines thing. The vaccines, right? The vaccine conspiracy theory, impressionistically to me, and I'm surrounded by it because I'm an autistic kid, is very female driven, because it's very much about, this is where the people who are troped as desperate are the mothers, right? And the mothers are out there looking for information.
I mean, I live in Tübingen. I mean, this is a very left-wing academic city. I would never bring up vaccination in the playground, where you're surrounded more by mothers than other fathers usually in the afternoon. I mean, I don't have a real job, so therefore I have time to do that. Because I would completely agree, in Germany too, this is something that is predominantly female. So everything that has to do with health and the body, anything that you have to take a stance on in your personal life, chemtrails, corona, vaccines, is at least 50-50. Whereas the more abstract political things, 9/11, Great Replacement, that's more of a masculine thing, because you can have your insights in the evening over the 5th beer, and then you can go and live the rest of the next day without thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Traditional division of labor is disappointing to a certain extent.
Yeah, it is.
But globalization is a keyword for final question from Brian Notting. We're approaching 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock in New York. Maybe you have other plans for the afternoon, so, which we don't want to spoil. Brian Notting has a really huge question. So thanks very much for the talk. I'm not a Russian expert, but I'm curious about how the relation between climate science and geopolitics might play into this. I'm thinking of the intimacy Latour highlights between critique and conspirational thinking, and how every once in a while I seem to come across a news section about Russians embracing climate change or even hoping for an accelerated version in order to promote a Russian geopolitical agenda, better farming, oil, so on and so forth. I think there was also a brief interview in Herzog's Happy People about this. Is this part of the geopolitical project?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And this is, not to say again, something I do talk about in the book, whereas climate change is a big part of conspiratorial rhetoric in the West, that it's a hoax, I see much less of that in Russia, precisely for the reasons that you bring up, that there are ways in which climate change could be advantageous to Russia. And in fact, one of the big theories involves this notion called the golden billion. That is that the rich people around the world know that thanks to climate change and other whatever sets of disasters we have, most of the world is going to be uninhabitable, and the world will only be able to support 1 billion people, and those are going to be the rich people. But the problem is, where are they going to live? Well, the one place on Earth where it's going to be good to live is Siberia. Because of climate change. And that is why the West is so desperate to tear Russia apart. That is why Matal and Albright supposedly said that Russia shouldn't have sole access to Siberia. That's, in this theory, that's what's motivating all of us to hate Russia so much, is that we need their land desperately. And that is really wonderful on so many levels, because so much of Russian conspiracy theory has this kind of traditional land-based feel to it, like about defending the land and the territory in a way that doesn't necessarily play out exactly like that in other countries. And this rationale absolutely works perfectly to explain why we all are so against Russian statehood, and why we need a weak Russia that can be taken apart to little bits so we can take over. And as I say this, I realize this could be some horrible video clip that could be played out of context, where this Jewish academic in America is talking about what we need to do to Russia.
Yeah, so then let me add something to that, to my personal conspiracy theory, which is about the weather, and that to show that we're all conspiracy theorists sometimes. So Eliot, you can't know that, but we've had a very, very cold and rainy spring here, unlike last year when the lockdown began. And I think that the government is behind that, because had it been really warm and sunny all the time, there would have been a tremendous pressure on them to actually open the terraces of restaurants and all that. And because of the weather, there was never any public demand for that. So I think they've been using this HARP thing in Antarctica that the Americans set up there years ago in order to manipulate the weather. And now that the numbers are down, the weather is miraculously improving. So this could also be taken out of context, and
yes,
I'm with you.
We're here in a wide release. So I don't see any further questions in the chat. I want to thank Eliot, first of all, for a very inspiring and also amusing talk, and Michael for his vivid engagement in the discussion. Also to the audience with very good questions, very interesting questions. I switch back to German, eine letzte Annonce loszuwerden. Die betrifft unsere nächste Mosse-Lecture am 10. Juni. Da ist zu Gast der Soziologe und Ethnologe Didier Fassin und wird sprechen zum Thema Conspiracy Theories, Crises and Critique. Der Untertitel, Anspielung auf Koselleck-Kritik und Krise, aber auch auf ein gemeinsames Projekt, das Didier Fassin gerade gemeinsam mit Axel Honneth verfolgt. Ich denke, wir können sehr gut anschließen an verschiedene Anregungen, Diskussionspunkte, die wir heute im Gespräch mit Eliot Borenstein und Michael Butter bekommen haben. Nochmal Dankeschön. Thank you again to New York and to Tübingen. Have a good evening and stay healthy.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It's great. Are we?